retired General Denis Thompson, former NATO task force commander. He's in Montreal today. General Thompson, good to see you. What do you think is going to happen at this meeting?
Oh, good afternoon, Todd. Well, the meeting is essentially about the counteroffensive. And as you've quite rightly pointed out, the Russians are running out of ammunition. North Korea uses Russian-built artillery pieces, or at least Russian, the same calibers as Russia, the 152 and the 122 and some other calibers that would be familiar to Russia, and they have them in enormous numbers. There are probably over 6,000 artillery pieces in North Korea alone. So their ammunition stocks must be absolutely enormous. I don't have a figure at hand, but it's quite considerable. What would they get in exchange? I'm not convinced that the Russians would give them any technology that would be what we would consider to be high-end today. And because the North Koreans operate basically a diesel-electric submarine fleet, there's not much that the Russians could do for them in that regard. They perhaps could help them with their ballistic missiles, but I don't think that that's what the North Koreans that the Russians would give them. I rather think it might be grain for bullets instead, because of course North Korea is always having a problem feeding its population.
Yeah, well said. So perhaps trade, perhaps economic help, perhaps actually food supplies for the North, which remains largely shut off, as you know, and has been, well, it's part of its history, but even more so, General Thompson, during the COVID-19 pandemic. For the Russians, I mean, access to those North Korean stockpiles, tell me the difference you think that might make on the ground as we continue to follow this Ukrainian counteroffensive.
Right. So everyone's still observing that the counteroffensive is rather slow. And as I've mentioned before, it's slow but not wasteful. It is essentially come down to a bit of an artillery duel, a counter-battery duel between the two sides. And that means that both sides, even the Ukrainians, are consuming more ammunition than they are receiving. And at this point, it's opined that there's basically parity between the two armies in terms of their ability to hammer each other's artillery and to cause casualties amongst themselves. So that's a balance that obviously Russia wants to tip back in their favor, where it was at the start of this war. It's also the reason why the Ukrainians are apt to use infiltration tactics and take advantage of the fact that their troops at the lowest level can execute much more initiative than the Russians can. But it doesn't get them through those very thick defense lines for the foreseeable future. So the bottom line here is that more artillery will help both sides, and the Russians are clearly going after the North Koreans for that. And if I could just very quickly say, it reminds me that if there was some future war involving China, it would be the equivalent of China going to Myanmar and asking them for ammunition. That's how desperate the Russians are at this point.
Well said. Thank you, General Thompson, as always. Much appreciated.